The kit comes with everything you'll need to complete the project. Access to a step-by-step illustrated instruction book corresponding to the steps in this video, fabric yardage custom printed with the textile print you chose and the pattern piece templates, and a notions kit with a preloaded bobbin and matching thread, sewing pins, a printed seam gauge, hand sewing needles, a seam ripper, just in case we know things don't always go as planned, and there's 3 additional tools you'll need to complete the project: an iron, a sewing machine, and scissors. Before we jump in, I'm going to explain the basic steps of the project. We'll start by sewing the front and the back pieces together, creating sort of a boxy tank. Then we'll sew the sleeves into tubes, and with the bodice and the sleeves fully sewn, we'll set the sleeve into the arm side, creating a t-shirt with 4 simple pieces. From there, we'll finish the neckline with a bias binding and finish the sleeves and the hem with a double folded top stitch edge. And then we'll have a finished t-shirt. So I'll start with a few notes about our paperless pattern system. The textile print extends all the way to the cut line of the pattern pieces, and the pieces are designed with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So, just to be clear, the seam lines are the lines of stitching that hold the pieces together, and the seam allowance is the extra space between the stitch line and the edge of the fabric that will end up on the inside of the piece. Because the textile print extends past the stitch line into the seam allowance, even if you don't stitch everything perfectly straight, you'll never see a gap or any unprinted fabric. The fabric is also printed directly with notches, so there's no need to clip them. Notches are the small marks perpendicular to the cut edge that act as guides while you're sewing. For this project, the notches help match up corresponding pieces, show how to clip the arm side piece, and indicate hemming lengths. The pattern templates are printed directly on the fabric, so I'll go ahead and cut them. So I've cut out the pattern pieces, and I just want to show you around a little bit. The front and back pieces look pretty similar, but you can distinguish them by the neckline. The front is more scooped out, whereas the back is a little bit straighter. The 2 sleeve pieces are identical to each other, but not symmetrical. The parabola slope here gives space for the shoulder and is shaped differently from the front and the back. And then those 4 pieces make up the body of the garment, and these last 2 pieces are going to be the bias binding for the neckline. What is special about these strips is that they're cut on the bias, which is a 45-degree angle. So they have a touch of give and will easily bend along the curved edge of the neckline. Now we're getting into the sewing steps of the project. If you're brand new to sewing, check out our Sewing 101 video. We go over all the basics there. I'm going to start by constructing the body of the garment, sewing the side seams and the shoulder seams of the body pieces. To create a nice finished edge on the inside, which is especially important with this slightly sheer fabric I'm using, I'm going to use French seams. A French seam is essentially a seam where the seam allowance, which is traditionally exposed and on the inside of the garment, gets encased in a second row of stitching, so the raw, fraying cut edge is no longer exposed. It's really simple and clever and a very versatile stitch. The main thing to be aware of with a French seam is that you start by stitching the pieces with the right sides to the outside, facing away from each other. It's easy to go on autopilot and start with the wrong sides together, which is how you position the pieces with a simple seam. So I'm going to pin the front and back pieces right side out, matching the notches, and pinning perpendicular to the seam line on the shoulders and the side seams. So now my piece is pinned together at the side seams and the shoulder seams. And the seam allowance for this project is a 1/2 inch, but because we're using French seams, which are made up of 2 rows of stitching, for the first row, we'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And later, when we do the second row, also at a 1/4 inch, the collective seam allowance will equal a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to stitch these seams at a 1/4 inch, making sure to backstitch at the end and the beginning of each stitch line. So I'm lining this up with the 1/4 inch mark on my foot and making a straight 1/4 inch seam all the way down the piece. And then I will sew the other side seam and the shoulder seams exactly the same way. I now have a tank top shaped piece with the bright pattern side of the fabric facing outside and the seam allowances to the outside as well. First, I'll trim all of the seam allowances down to 1/8 of an inch. This becomes important when we do the second row of stitching. You're not taking much off, but you're evening out the seam allowance and getting rid of any frayed edges and trimming it back to that 1/8 of an inch. Now that these are trimmed, next I'm going to press the seams flat from the outside with the seam allowance pressed over to one side. It can be a little tricky on a flat surface like this, but if you have an ironing board that has an arm, you can drape the t-shirt over that board. So I'm taking the iron and kind of pulling either side of the fabric, and then I'll press the seam allowance over to one side. And just making sure that the seam is opened up really nice and flat. At this stage, it doesn't matter which side you press the seam allowance to, as long as it's to one side evenly. So now my seam allowances are pressed open, I'm going to turn the entire piece inside out so that the right sides are facing to the inside and the seam allowances are inside as well. Now, when I press the folded seam flat to prepare for the second row of stitching, I'll double check that the seam edge is pushed out flush and not tucked under or inside at all. So I can kind of adjust. And I just want that seam line to be the very edge of that fold. This ensures that your seam allowance maintains that 1/2 inch and that the fit is correct. And also just makes a nice tidy seam. So I can use the iron to press this down, and then I'll also pin that into place. So now that this is pinned and pressed, I'll take it to the machine and make the second line of stitching that completes the French seams. So I'm lining up the folded edge with the small divot on the presser foot of my machine that indicates the 1/4 inch seam mark. This could be indicated differently on your machine, so be sure to measure to make sure where that 1/4 inch mark is. When I sew this second line of stitching, it will be what encases the seam allowance inside the sort of channel that I'm making. This is why it's important to trim the edge down to 1/8 inch, because if I hadn't, I might catch that seam allowance in the line of stitching, and then the fraying edge would poke out of my seam to the outside of the garment. This first line of stitching also isn't receiving any stress, so when I trim it down, it won't be problematic structurally. So I'll stitch like this along the shoulders and sides. Now the second line of stitching is sewn, I'll press the seam allowances towards the back of the garment and the body of the t-shirt is complete. Again, when I'm pressing, I'll just sort of pull both sides of this so that I am ensuring that the seam is completely open. So just to show you, now we have the inside of the garment with these beautifully finished seams. And the seam allowance is kind of encased inside this channel. And then the outside of the garment looks just like it would if it had the simple seams, just a clean finished seam edge. But we know with the French seams that it's more protected and they won't fray. So next I'll move on to the sleeve. The sleeve pieces have a little parabola on top, and this is the part that goes around the shoulder and gives it space to move. To start, I'll connect the short sides to make the sleeve into a three-dimensional tube shape. And this seam will connect to the shirt body under the arm, lining up with the side seam on the shirt. I'll also use a French seam for this, so I'll fold the piece right sides out and pin the edges. Then I'll sew this at 1/4 inch and repeat the same process to make it into a French seam. Sewing at the 1/4 inch, trimming down to 1/8, pressing it flat, flipping it inside out, and stitching again at 1/4 inch. And I'm actually going to press the seam allowance to the front side, which is the side that has the filled in triangle, and pressing it to the front side will make it the opposite side to where I press the seam allowances on the side seam to the back. So it'll just reduce bulk at the underarm seam. Now I have one sleeve together, so you can see, and I'll repeat the same process on the other sleeve, and then we'll move on to connecting the sleeves to the shirt body. To start this step, the t-shirt body piece will be turned so that the pattern on the fabric is the inside, and the sleeve pieces will both be right sides out. The sleeve pieces look fairly symmetrical, but they're actually mirror images of each other, and they're slightly different from the front to the back to accommodate the shape of the shoulder. The back has a filled-in triangle. On this one it's white. If the notches are white, it'll be white. And the front has a triangle made up with just thin line. So we'll place the sleeve inside the shirt and find the triangles on the shirt body that correspond with the triangles on the sleeve. We'll pin those into place. If the triangles don't correspond, you just have to switch the sleeve pieces to the other side and they will correspond to that side. So I'm going to slide this piece kind of inside the t-shirt, and you can see the two open triangles, so with the white outside, line up, and I'll pin those. And on the other side, I have this white triangle and that white triangle, and I'm gonna line those up and pin those into place. Then I'm gonna line up the seam on the sleeve with the side seam on the body. And remember how we press the seams on the body to the back, and then we press the seam on the sleeve to the front? So when I line these seams up, the seam is going to line up exactly, but the seam allowances will go to either side of the seam, and that just helps reduce the bulk at the underarm area. So with those 3 pieces pinned into place, lastly I'm going to find this little dot notch that's on the top of the parabola, and I'll line that up with the seam at the shoulder of the garment, and then I'll pin that into place. So now I have my sleeve pinned into place in 4 places, and this just helps determine the correct orientation and spacing of the sleeve. Before I continue with the pinning, you'll notice that between the triangle pins and the shoulder seam pin, the sleeve piece looks too big to line up with the body piece. This is because one piece has a curved edge and the other has a straight edge. So while the stitch line and the cut line are the same length on the straight piece, the curved piece is essentially 2 concentric arcs, so the seam lines are the same length on these 2 pieces, but the cut edge of the sleeve piece is much longer. To help counter this, I'll make little clips into the seam allowance of the body piece so that I can actually spread that seam allowance of the straight edge to fit along the larger curve of the sleeve piece. The body piece has little notches along the top between the 2 triangle notches to indicate where to clip. So I'll clip into those 3/8 of an inch, and once these are clipped, I can pin the edges together, starting at the middle point between the existing pins, and then work in halves to get everything as even as possible. So, clipping in at these notches. Now with the help of those notches, what felt like not big enough before is now able to stretch and actually be big enough to line up with that curved edge. So then I start the pinning at the middle, and I end up using way more pins, like about an inch and a half apart than I do on a straight seam, just because this attaching a curve to a straight line is a little bit trickier. And then I'll also pin from the triangles through the underarm seam. This doesn't need any clipping because the shape of these 2 pieces mirrors each other, so it actually lines up pretty easily on its own. So when I start sewing the sleeve in, I'll start at the underarm seam, and I'm actually going to pull this machine deck off so that it's a little bit easier for me to sew in this kind of tighter area. And because of the curve of this, I'm actually not using a French seam, I'm using a simple seam. So I'm going to be stitching this at 1/2 inch seam allowance to set the sleeve in, and then to finish the edge, I'm going to use a zigzag. So we'll get to that stitch in a minute. So I'm lining this up with my 1/2 inch mark on my machine and starting at that underarm seam. And taking that bed off really helps me sew around this tighter space. And keeping the seam allowance consistent on a curve, which we haven't really done before on this project, is a little bit trickier because the fabric is kind of stretchier on the curve. So just take this slowly and feel free to sort of adjust it manually with your needle down, kind of lifting your presser foot up if you feel like you are having trouble kind of maintaining that 1/2 inch edge. When you're done with the seam, double check that there aren't any tucks in the sleeve piece. Because of the geometry of the pieces in this connection, it's a little bit easier to accidentally get small tucks or pleats in the under layer of the fabric. So if you notice any tucks or areas where the seam allowance got wider than 1/2 inch, simply use your seam ripper to take out that section with the problem and restitch that specific area. But if the seam looks good, we'll trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. So just trimming this back to, again, make the seam allowance as even as possible and unfrayed, and then a little bit smaller, 3/8 of an inch is perfect. And then we'll take this and zigzag the edge to finish it. And whenever I'm trimming a seam, I'm always using my guiding hand to make sure that there isn't like a second layer of fabric that's getting caught in my scissors. So this hand is sort of protecting the body of the fabric and the sleeve of the fabric and really informing my scissor hand of what's happening. So no disasters ensue. So I have that seam allowance neatly trimmed down to 3/8 of an inch, and to keep it from fraying, I'm going to zigzag the edge with a fairly dense zigzag stitch. So I'll adjust the length to between the 1 and the 2, and the width up to 4, and then I'm going to stitch all the way around just in the seam allowance, and this will just help strengthen that connection and keep the seam allowance from fraying down. So now I have this nicely finished zigzag edge. Now I've set in both sleeves, and to finish this step, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve with the tip of the iron. This is particularly important at the top of the sleeve cap, just to get a nice flat connection there. So the t-shirt is fully constructed. I just need to finish the raw edges. I'm going to use two different methods to finish the edges because the neckline has a curve and the hems of the sleeve and the t-shirt are on the straight of grain. For the curved neckline, I'll use bias binding, which is cut at a 45-degree angle to the straight of grain and therefore has flexibility and stretch. If you picture a grid of threads going vertically and horizontally, which is basically what plain weave cotton lawn is, then imagine pulling that structure from either direction, sideways or up and down. You'd be pulling those threads directly, and because those threads don't have stretch, that piece has no give or ease when you pull it in that direction. So if you made a bias binding that with the straight of grain, it wouldn't be able to flex around a curve. In contrast, the 45-degree angle of the bias changes the orientation of the grid-like structure so that the vertical and horizontal threads are making an X. Now when you pull the fabric sideways or up and down, you aren't pulling directly on either end of an individual thread. Instead, your pulling is kind of warping that grid structure, and because of this, when you make a bias binding, you're able to manipulate it around the curve beautifully. It's really kind of magic. I'll start by seaming the two pieces of bias binding together to create one long strip. So I'll take one piece with the right side up and then I'll flip the other over so that the right side is down. Then I'll line up the diagonal edges and just so. So the diagonal edges are lined up and the pieces are coming out at a 90-degree angle. Then I'll just slide the piece over far enough so that the cut edge of the top diagonal lines up with the notch of the lower one. Then I'll pin that into place, and this could look a little funny because the tips of both of the diagonal pieces extend past, but if you look at where the stitch line is, it actually starts and ends where the two pieces overlap. So I'll bring this piece to the machine and sew along that diagonal edge, joining these bias binding sections. Now I'm going to press this seam open. I can start with my fingers and then use the tip of the iron. And I can just trim off these little diagonals that extend past the binding edge. Now I have one continuous piece of bias binding. So I'm going to start by pinning this around the neck opening, lining up the seam that I just made with one of the shoulder seams. First, however, I'm going to turn the t-shirt right side out. So we'll have the t-shirt facing right side out, and then when we pin and line up the bias binding, we'll pin the bias binding so that the right side of the bias binding is facing the right side of the t-shirt fabric. So I'm lining up the seam with one of the side seams, or one of the shoulder seams, and I'll pin that into place. And then I'm just following the curve of the neckline and lining up the bias binding edge with the neckline and just pinning it along as I go. And you will really notice that there is some stretch in that bias binding, and you don't want to stretch it as you're lining it up because then it'll cause the neckline to pucker. So you're just placing it nicely around there. So I've pinned the bias around the front edge, and now I'll pin it around the back edge here. So now I have the bias pinned all the way around the neckline, and I have the free ends concluding where I have my other shoulder seam. And I'll have a little extra length on either end here. So I'll take one and I'll fold it back at the side seam at a 45-degree angle. This is a little funny, but I'm basically taking that back, folding it at a 45-degree angle, and seeing exactly where it'll intersect that side seam. And then I'm taking my other side here, and I'm basically folding it so that, folding it back to a 45-degree angle, kind of lining it up to match the folded edge of the first side. And I'll kind of crease that into place with my fingers, and then I can take out the pins right at the edge if you need to, just so you can work with this. And you'll use those finger creases to mark where you want to sew these ends together. And the reason these are a little bit longer than you actually need is just because if anyone wanted to sort of change the neckline or adjust it a little bit, we gave you a little extra length. So that's why these pieces aren't the exact right length. You'll always have a little bit of extra. So I've pinned these overlapping so that the crease lines line up. And then we'll stitch along that edge using the crease as a guide. The bias is now a full loop, so I'll trim off the excess, press it open, and then repin the rest of the neckline. I can just press this open with my fingers. So when I repin this, the seam line that we just made in the bias binding will line up with the shoulder seam. Now I'll stitch the bias binding around the neckline at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So just stitching along the curved edge, connecting that bias binding to the neckline of the shirt. If the seam allowance is at all uneven, trim off the excess in any areas to make sure that it's evenly a 1/4 inch all the way around. It's important that this is even because you'll be using the seam allowance to guide the rest of the binding step, and this will become the thin decorative border edge at the neckline. So I'm just going to check. It'll really be like at the seam lines that you might have some kind of excess, but mine looks even. And now I'm going to use the iron to press this bias binding kind of up away from the body of the garment. So once the bias binding is pressed up away from the body of the garment, we're actually going to fold it again. You'll fold the cut edge of the bias binding right down to the cut edge of the seam allowance. So you're basically just kind of folding the excess in half. So then we'll press that fold down. And this might be one of those things that's easier to press with your fingers and then kind of confirm with the iron, because it's a little unruly because it's on the curve, on the bias. So I'm folding that edge over. So now I have the cut edge of the bias binding folded. I'm going to fold this over again to the inside of the garment so that the seam allowance is fully encased inside this bias binding. Then I'll pin that into place, and I'm going to top stitch from the front edge along the bias edge about 1/16 of an inch, and I'll top stitch that around the neckline and make sure I catch the back side, which will secure the folded bias binding into place. So to stitch this bias binding in place, we're going to stitch from the top and stitch about 1/16 of an inch away from the bias binding connection to where it connects into the shirt. The important thing about this stitch is that you remain an even amount from this seam line, and that you're also making sure to catch the folded over bottom side, because this stitch is what holds that in place. Be helpful just before you do a section to make sure that you can't see the stitch line, because then you know you'll be catching that bottom layer. So I'll flip it over, look, and then continue through that section. So now you can see it's caught on the inside and then has a nice decorative row of top stitching on the outside. So once you've top stitched the bias binding in place, just double check and make sure you don't have any spots where you didn't catch the bias binding from the underside. It's pretty easy to do, and it's very easy to fix. So you can either take a seam ripper and rip out the section just where you didn't catch the bias binding, and then repinning that to make sure that you'll catch it the next time. You can just stitch over that one section. If you don't want to disturb the line of top stitching, however, you can just take your hand sewing needle and secure that little area in with a whip stitch. So start with a knot, and then the whip stitch is just an invisible stitch where you'll take a tiny section of the bias binding and then a tiny section of the seam allowance, and just use that hand sewing needle to secure that small spot where you didn't catch the bias binding. And that'll take just a minute. And then I'll show you from the other side that's fully invisible, and the stitch line that you put in originally will maintain its integrity. So you can just knock that off. And then take one more stitch and you can trim the stitch line. So that kind of thing will fix any area that you happen to not catch with your bias binding if you have an area like that. So that was the hard part. Finishing the straight of grain edges on the sleeves and the bottom is way more simple. The pattern pieces have two different hemming suggestions, a full length suggestion and a cropped option. You may not be able to see the crop marks now that the side seams are fully sewn. So if you want to follow our cropped length, trim the bottom edge off by 5 inches. My suggestion at this stage is to just try the top on and play with the sleeves and body length in a mirror. So with the t-shirt off, you'll measure the distance from the bottom edge to the finish fold, and then add 1/2 inch for the hem. So I'm measuring from the fold in 1/2 inch, and then I will mark that with a pin. And at this stage, you can actually unpin what you folded up when you were trying it on. And you have the finished distance from where you have your seam allowance of the 1/2 inch to the edge, and you just want to repeat that all the way around. So you can either use a ruler, or if you want, you can just take that pin marking and sort of mirror it around the bottom edge and continue marking that with a pin. So you'll just go around, marking that distance and using a pin to mark it. And then when you have that all the way around, you can just cut off that distance with scissors. And if you want to keep the t-shirt full length, which I'm going to do in this video, you don't need to trim off anything at all. Now, with the t-shirt inside out, I'm going to fold up the bottom edge 1/4 inch and press it. Then fold the edge 1/4 inch again and press this flat and pin it. So I can use my printed seam gauge for this and just measure 1/4 inch, and I'll do that all the way around. I like to crease it with my fingers and then come back with the iron once I have like a nice long section folded up. And one thing to note, the side seams, we press them to the back, and when you sewed the sleeve on, you like attach that side seam to the back. So you just want to make sure that the seam allowance is pressed in the same direction so that it isn't kind of warping and being caught in two different directions. So on the back here, folding this up 1/2 inch. So I have the full bottom edge all pressed up 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to fold it up and press it again at 1/4 inch. And at that point, you won't see any of the cut raw edge. It'll be inside that double fold. So and you can pin this second edge as you're pressing it. So now I'm going to stitch this about 1/16 of an inch away from the folded edge. And I'll start my top stitch at a side seam so that the back tack isn't visible in like the front of the shirt. So I'm just gonna line that up, and I'm just stitching right along the edge, catching the fold, and then from the front of the garment you'll just see a nice line of top stitching that's about a 1/4 inch away from the bottom edge. So hemming the sleeves is exactly the same, but it can be a touch trickier just because of the narrow circumference of the sleeve. I'd recommend removing this machine bed so that you can do the top stitching a little more easily. Now all the edges on the hem and sleeve are beautifully finished, so trim the threads, give everything a final press, and you're done. Thanks so much for sewing with me today. I hope you had fun and learned a few new sewing skills. I brought Amelia back to show off our completed t-shirt project. We love that you can make this piece in a cropped or full length, and I love how Amelia's wearing it tucked into high-waisted jeans for a pop of color.
We are Amelia and Emily, the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co, and we look forward to sewing with you again soon. Please see the link below to check out our other sewing kits on our website and subscribe to our channel to stay in touch. Goodbye for now.